Thank you.
some of you listening are already familiar with Camille, if you're in the membership, or if you've ever been in this recent course, that might be it. Or if you went on my website, but Camille is new to our family, and she's doing a lot of good work with us, specifically helping us with the collective management. Like, so when we do a course or in our membership, we have this forum. It's a private online forum where everyone can share like resources and ask questions. And Camille is a Virgo, and she, capital V, capital I, and she goes on there and you answer the questions as if it's me answering them. So I'm always amazed by your ability to not just understand, but integrate all this work that we do, all this somatic work. It's amazing. So anyway, you're building my capacity, and I thank you for that. But that's how I know you. Tell us about you. Who are you to you? Introduce yourself to this beautiful audience.
Sure. Oh, such a question. Who am I? Um,
It's probably
so,
not true, but we'll play with it.
so yeah, I mean, a little bit about me. I guess I really began to come into this somatic work about a year ago, learned more about you and somatic experiencing, and have just sort of been on my own journey as it relates to decolonization that really, I guess, sparked about 6 years ago when I gave birth to my first child. And although everyone said it'd be a horrible experience, it was one of the most peaceful experiences in my life. And I remember thinking, like, why can't the rest of my life be like that? And so since then, I've sort of just been on this journey of really decolonizing and trying to find out what it means for me to be centered, aligned, and grounded on a consistent and persistent basis. And a little bit of that journey has also been related to my own personal work. So I am a diversity, inclusion, and equity practitioner. And so I support organizations and individuals on their journey to move from what I call apathy to advocacy. So how do you show up as allies and advocates to marginalized identities? And increasingly, I found that a missing part of that work, particularly in the corporate space where I began, was really understanding our relationship to trauma. Generational trauma, community trauma, and understanding even if we don't have a marginalized identity, we can still experience cultural trauma, and can't really bypass understanding that trauma to get to inclusion and equity.
There's so much I want to ask you. I love that the birth experience was like your initiation, because it's such a sensational experience.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I kind of wonder, what was life like before that for you? Like, how did you live and exist in your body? And then what shifted?
Yeah. So it was this interesting sort of simultaneous thing throughout my entire life. So I've always, for a long time, I was really, really uncomfortable in my body. I've always been sort of big, fat, and Black. Like from the age of 5, I was physically really imposing on people, and both implicitly and explicitly, that was known to me by others, and made known to me by others. So I felt really, really uncomfortable in my body for a very, very long time. At that same time, for whatever reason, I don't know if it's divine intervention or like ancestral wisdom, but I knew, even before I knew I wanted to have kids, that if I had kids, it wasn't going to be in a hospital. It wasn't going to be with doctors. Something in me was just told me, like, you're not sick when you're giving birth. So you don't need to go to a hospital. You don't need to go to a doctor. There was just something, even though I didn't like my body, that was like the one thing I knew. And so as I got older, even though I was still really uncomfortable in my body, that stayed with me. And even when I did get to a place where I wanted to have children, again, I just knew I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this at a birthing center. I'm going to have a midwife. Even though a lot of folks would say, which was really surprising to me, I mean, a lot of people who would say, like, oh, you can do that? I didn't know you had that choice. I didn't know you had that option, which was mind blowing to me, that people didn't realize they had options and how they could give birth. But I realized that in the midst of labor, like as I'm going through a contraction, even though I couldn't verbalize it at the time, it's just like, I'm really, really grounded. I'm really, really aligned. It was and I have this word now, it was one of the most expansive experiences. And I finally realized, even though I knew this going into it, but I didn't really know it till I experienced it, is that fundamentally I got out of the way and let spirit and nature do their thing. Like I didn't have to do anything except trust, except sort of just self-surrender. And so that was a big pivot point, that outside of that, everything else in my life, I was trying to force fit. I'm supposed to look a certain way. I'm supposed to eat a certain way. I'm supposed to make money a certain way. And in that moment, I realized, well, what if I ascribed the way I approached birth to everything else in my life? Now, that was a big question to myself, because then I was just like, well, how can I do that? It felt like I could create this container for myself as it related to birth. But for everything else, it felt like, well, everybody else controls those spaces. How do I assert and affirm myself in spaces that I don't control?
So I love this because when I think of trauma healing somatically, I'm often comparing it to contractions
Mm,
because, right? Because just like when you said letting nature take over, it, the experience of a body birthing another body is so ancient. It's
mm,
like what this planet is made of, essentially,
yeah.
whether it's a seed from a fruit or a human body. And in that is this strange, and I've only experienced it empathically, is this strange moment of I'm supposed to open into something that I actually want to close against, right? And I find that to be so beautiful. As you know, with the work that I do, we're consistently witnessing this residue and charge of threat, which we call trauma in the body. And the body wants to do everything in its power to constrict against that. And the most strange, counterintuitive way of releasing it is actually, I have to open into this threatening charge. So, how did you experience that giving birth? Like, tell me, is that what you're talking
Yeah,
about as
no,
well?
that totally is. Like when people ask me, well, like, how do I not have a horrible contraction? I'm just like, you gotta relax. I know it sounds so hokey saying it, but it really is. You just kind of gotta lean into it, and I do think it goes back to that trust. Now, things that helped me sort of going into it, like expanding into the contraction, was one, just reminding myself, like, people have been doing this for years. Like, you don't have to. If it was so bad, humans would not exist. I, I actually, this helped me. I actually decided to watch some videos of animals giving birth, and again, just kind of watch chimpanzees, specifically bonobo chimpanzees, because they're closest to humans. And I watched this bonobo chimpanzee giving birth, and they were just so relaxed. They were just kind of, you wouldn't even think that they were giving birth. Like, they were still walking around, they were eating, they were socializing. It wasn't until like the very, very end that they kind of went off into a corner and did their thing. That just sort of affirmed to me that the way you do it is to just sort of relax. And when you tense up, that's when it becomes even worse. And one thing that did really, well, part of my journey was that I think a lot of the initial constriction comes from is that we're told it's supposed to hurt. I know I grew up watching TV shows where women go into labor. Oh my God, I can't. Hey, get this baby out of me. Okay, so it's supposed to be a horrible experience. Or even like in the church, like, okay, Eve committed the first sin, so that's why your period and babies hurt. This is the burden you have to bear as a
Yeah.
woman. So like all of this, like, it's supposed to hurt. It's supposed to be painful. What if the narrative was
Mhm.
different? What if we were told, like, actually, it's an incredible experience. It's
Mm.
it's beautiful. And I tell this to people, it wasn't easy, but it was one of the most easeful experiences of my life.
See, I find that whole like societal conditioning to be true for everything, like
Mhm.
death, loss, love, grief. Like we have so many ideas what these are supposed to be like
Yes.
that, right? Like when they're happening, we actually believe it's the worst thing in the world. Yet there is this nature, this ancestry and ancientness to ancients of all of these painful human experiences. They're vital to life. And so I love to see what it's like to deconstruct what I've been told I should feel from actually what am I actually feeling, right? Is it actually as bad as I think it is? Right? Because my mind is overcoupling an entire connotation over a situation that's actually unfurling and changing every second. It's not fixed. Um, and as I'm saying it, it segues me into the DEI work. Because, you know, I think of like for many people, like it sounds so boring, like no offense to you. It's just like, you know, because like when you hear an acronym, you're like, oh, what's that? But it's so rich and powerful and beautiful. And I especially love the way that you hold it because it comes from that same place in you of essentially like, who are we in relationship with one another without the bias, without the prejudice, without, right? And I want you in your own words to tell me what that means to you.
Absolutely, because yeah, I see all things as connected. So people like, what does birth have to do with diversity and inclusion? But I actually have a very similar experience where people would say, you know, giving natural birth, like, oh my gosh, that must be horrible. That must be so hard. People say the same thing about being a DEI practitioner, like, oh my gosh, that must be so draining. You have to deal with people and their biases and their prejudices and saying really ignorant things. It must take a lot out of you. Actually, I find it really invigorating. After I facilitate a session, I feel really good. I don't feel drained. I don't feel used because I think I approached it very similar to the way I approached giving birth, where it was I wanted to stay in a place of curiosity. Like, well, let's just see, where does this take us? And so I know I do approach DEI work a little bit differently than some other practitioners, and you know, everyone has their approach to it, but one of the things that I personally um, practice is that my goal is not to change anything about anyone. I put absolutely no energy into trying to change somebody's behaviors or their beliefs because I can't. Fundamentally, what my goal is to do as a facilitator, a DEI facilitator, is simply to create a space and a place where they may be exposed to a perspective or experience they hadn't considered. And maybe that sparks something in them to want to dig a little bit deeper, to want to understand more. And I love being a conduit or facilitator for that experience.
I love that so much because that was what made me want to hire you onto my team, right? It wasn't that you did DEI work. It was that you did it with that amount of curiosity and interest. And there was just this sense, and Marika and were always talking about it. There was a sense of you, because you were in the course, that's how I met you. There was like this sense of you just being okay with everything. And people get that confused with like, you know, like not even allowing, what's the word we get it confused with?
Like I was passivity, but even
Passive,
I'm
even
a little
passivity.
okay with
Yeah,
passive.
me
I'm
too.
like, okay,
Me
I'm
too.
passive,
Like, I'll
but
do
I
it.
know a lot of people don't. They're like, oh, you're so passive.
Yeah, I think there's this idea, and I think it's increased. Maybe it's always been here, but now with technology we hear it more. But there's this idea that if you're not against something, you're for it,
Mm,
right? And
yeah.
you know,
Let's
and
talk about that.
let's talk about that because that's what really attracted me to working with you was I could just feel something in your spirit, your face. I don't know what it was. You weren't against anything, and I was like, that's interesting because a lot of people who do any kind of diversity work of any kind, like, and I always have to say this out loud, we always think when we hear this, we're just talking about Black people.
Yes.
We're not. We're talking about any minority of any, like, what, like, help me out, what, like,
Yeah.
sex,
So,
race,
so,
religion,
so
tell us.
gender identity, religion. I even do politics. A lot of DEI practitioners won't get into that. Disability status, veteran status. I mean, it's all these different things.
Yes.
Fundamentally, diversity is just the things that make us different from one another.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. That's what I love. It's like you holding space for variety. And what I find so important is, um, again, in this landscape, there's such, and this is where the trauma piece comes in, there's such a fear of being banished that we're so quick to fawn or we're so quick to fight or flight, but we don't really have curiosity as much,
Mhm.
right? Like, that person opposes everything I believe. Why? Versus I need to get as far away from this as possible so no one thinks I'm like them, or I need to shame them, right? So
Yeah.
tell me about this thing of like, if I'm not against it, I'm for it.
So yeah, so part of my journey, even as a kid growing up, was binary. Like I never really got the idea of binary. I can't remember where I heard it from, but one of the first things I remember hearing as a child is someone say, the Constitution is like the Bible. You don't get to pick and choose. And I remember thinking, why not? There might be pieces of the Bible or the Constitution I agree with, and there might be pieces of it that I don't. Why is it all or nothing? And that has sort of been sort of my curiosity, or the lens through which I perceive a lot of people, is that all of nothing. Either you're with us or against us. Either you can either be conquered or be a conqueror, and I'd prefer to be a conqueror. And I was like, but wait, I feel like there's a middle between that. You don't have to be conquered or be a conqueror. But it was that binary thinking that I just found so pervasive across everything. And the part of diversity and inclusion work that I really loved was this idea of a spectrum, this idea of gray, this idea of things are fluid. And I get, for a lot of people, that's hard because that's confusing. The binary is easy because if I know this one thing about you, then I can predict 78 things about you. But if we allow for gray, if we allow for a spectrum, it feels like, oh, now things are just so complex, we don't know what to do. But I get the logic of that, but intuitive, how it feels in my body, it actually feels much more simple to allow for nuance, to allow for the gray, to allow for spectrum. Even when we think about things like whether it's religion or gender identity or sexuality, if we just say, oh yeah, it's a spectrum, and we just left it there, I don't know, it just feels
Mhm.
much more intuitive in my body.
And that's a gift of yours, you came into this planet with, because I completely relate to that.
Mhm.
Like I mean, especially the body I was born in, the family I was born into, the mind I was born into, I biologically didn't have a binary. So for me, the idea of to me, queer was having a binary, like before queer became what it is now, like that, it used to be like a negative term when I was growing up. It's like, I was like, no, the weird people are the ones that actually believe what's one or the other. Like that was so strange to me. And so what I love what you were saying was, and again, this is where the trauma information comes in for those of us listening who want to like build capacity for disagreement, or those of you who are mediators or inclusion specialists, and anything you do to try to create more relating. That's really what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to relate more. That piece of, if I know what it is, then I can predict what's next. That's the piece that is driven from our traumatized systems,
Mm.
because trauma does not like spontaneity. It does not like it. So when our systems are filled with charge from traumatic events, and we're always on the edge of being over adrenalized, we have PTSD and we're hyper vigilant, we're looking for something to go wrong. And if I know you are a white, straight, racist guy, and I've decided that's who you are, there's no other nuance for you, I'm allowed to mobilize into my defenses. And from that place, there's a sense of safety, there's a sense of knowing. If I question that, and I think there must be more to you than that, or if you believe that, where did that come from? There's an openness in me to that person. And just like with the birth, this is how they relate, like you were saying, it's like my intuition, what I've been taught, the reflex of having a traumatized system. If I judge something in you as bad, I also judge it as a threat, and I immediately constrict against it. It's strange to actually open your heart into someone that you think could be a threat.
Mhm.
And all of you listening, I'm not saying you walk arms open into someone with a weapon. I mean, like in your spirit, in your nervous system, in your mind, right? Opening up to the curiosity of that individual, that feels very vulnerable and scary to the body, right? So, how do you, and again, this is just keep saying, one of the reasons I wanted to work with you was because, and anyone listening, if you like, Camille is a Black woman who walks and walked into primarily white, cisgendered, straight male spaces. Now, like with dozens of men, that interests me because that takes a certain amount of capacity. It'd be like any of you listening who are Democrats walking into a room of 100 Republicans. That would
Mhm.
terrify some of you. Like, that's what it's like. How is it for you to walk into the spaces and not judge them, not be angry at them? Or if you
Yeah.
did, what did you do with that? Like, I'm curious about that.
So that was a journey too, where, because it's also related so many things in my head. But so yeah, there is that overcoupling. Like totally understand why when we have marginalized identities, we constrict, because there was a point when we were open, we were vulnerable, and we were hurt. And when we constricted, we were then safe. So if I just anticipate that hurt coming from the dominant or privileged identity, I can avoid being hurt again. For me, that could only take me so far. For me, that wasn't living, and that wasn't loving. And that really came to awareness for me after the birth of my first child. So after my first child, Malcolm, after being on maternity leave for a while, I went back into work, and there were a lot of things happening that year with some police brutality and police officers killing unarmed Black citizens. And I would find myself sitting at my desk just welling up, having sort of this emotional reaction. And at that point, I'm still in my colonized self, where I was just like, we don't cry at work, especially you're a woman, Camille, get your shit together. What are you doing? You know, and I didn't even know what I was crying about. Because I anticipated once I had a child that maybe my concerns around police brutality, racial profiling would increase. And so I was really prepared for that. Maybe I would have a greater sense of fear, a greater sense of anger. But that's not what I was feeling. And then after a while, I came to the realization, oh, I'm not angry or even hateful or fearful right now. What I'm feeling is guilt. And nobody prepared me for that. It never entered my mind that there would come a point where I would feel like immense waves of guilt for choosing to bring a Black person into this world, knowing that what they would have to experience. So after coming to that realization, I really just had to spend a little bit of time, not just coming to terms with what my child would experience in this world, but what I had already experienced. And I got to a place where I understood, yes, racism is very real. Racial profiling is very real. And right now in this moment, for example, my kids are outside playing and having fun. Right now, in this moment, I am doing this awesome podcast with you, and that is where I'm choosing to put my energy. So I'm not choosing to dwell in the potential impact of racism or racial profiling on them or me, but I do recognize it as a part of our daily lives. And then specifically in corporate America, when I was dealing with predominantly older, white, cisgender, straight men who didn't really have an appetite for DEI. One of the key things that I had to learn in terms of their reaction is that it had nothing to deal with me. And now I even have the wording for it after engaging with you. I wasn't even engaging with them. I was engaging with their trauma response. Because again, they hadn't done their work when it came to any trauma they may have experienced, let alone trauma specifically as it relates to any form of culture, generation, diversity. So I wasn't really engaging them, and they weren't engaging with me. What I was engaging with was their need to fight or flight or fawn. And so that helped me. This isn't about Camille in this moment, but this is about everything that they've experienced leading up to it. And so that really helped me. And it was interesting because it would manifest in some interesting ways where I'd be doing the session, and maybe as it related to LGBTQ people, and someone was like really obstinate towards it. And then throughout the session, they get to a place where they would say, well, I had a parent when I was 12 who left because they up and decided to be gay. And I don't care about them being gay, but I was 12 and then they were just kind of gone. They moved. And I said, that's what we're dealing with here. And so it was just those kind of things that I found to be important. And I've shared this with you. Like I oftentimes use the Yoda quote, fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering. So my practice is really just to remember that underlying any sort of hate or anger I encounter, it's fear, it's that trauma.
So gorgeous. I mean, there's so many things you spoke to that I thought were really profound. I loved the example of attunement and orientation when you were talking about the reality of like collective racialized trauma and profiling, and the possibility of that occurring to you or your family. And am I oriented toward the possibility of it, or am I oriented toward the reality that right now it's not happening? That's such a powerful practice that I find so many people with trauma, when they start practicing that, regardless of whatever the trauma is
Mm,
from, it frees them because in this moment when you're actually able to attach to the reality that nothing's happening now, even if it does, you get to live in this reality of I'm safe now until I'm not, compared to I'm feeling threatened until I'm actually threatened. It's two different ways of living. And it's not, it's like the opposite of bypassing. Because people have said to me, like, Luis, aren't you just teaching us bypassing? I'm like, nope. Because bypassing would say it doesn't exist. Bypassing would say, you're making it up. Bypassing would say, don't focus on it. What I love about attunement and orienting is we orient to the present so we have capacity for what's real, right? So when I see something on the news or when I experience it in my own body, I get to experience it from having capacity versus I'm experiencing it from having super low capacity because I've been in a stuck trauma response because I'm
mhm,
like imagining and waiting for it or taking it in, from media, regardless of whatever the situation is.
mhm,
So I find that to be really profound. And the piece you're saying about realizing when you're with these men and their anger, their shutdown, their fawning, whatever it wasn't them, it was their trauma response. And that's why I just, the dictator in me wants everyone to be trauma informed. It's like, can I just make everyone be trauma informed? It's like, no, I can't. Let it go, Louise. But it's something about that lights me up because of what you just said. When we are trauma informed, we start seeing each individual body as an animal that has all this stored knowledge that the mind doesn't know it has. So when this person's like spitting at me or yelling at me or calling me a name, that's that animal reflexively responding to me based on its own trauma. It doesn't mean I let them do it, but it comes from a place where I'm not identifying with it. I don't think it's my fault. I'm not using my energy to judge them. I'm not cluttering my heart with hatred. I actually understand it and I choose to walk away from it.
mhm.
Is that where you're at now as well?
Yes, yes, absolutely. Yeah, again, yeah, like I, I really love the idea of attachment and detachment, and that was something in working with you that I was really able to work through because I did. I thought because people had told me, "Oh, you're bypassing or you're dissociating." I was like, "I'm not," and through your course, I was able to understand the difference between dissociating and detachment. I recognize what is happening around me, or I recognize the energy a person is sending my way, and I'm not attaching to it. That is to say, it's not about me personally, but it is the response of their collective experience. And to your point, that's not to excuse or dismiss the behavior, but I can totally understand it. I can empathize with it because guess what? I'm not perfect. There has been aspects in my life where I've probably displayed the very same trauma responses because of things that I've been conditioned with or things that I've experienced. So if I want people to create space or have grace for me, I'd absolutely like to extend that to other people.
I love that, especially when you just said, you yourself have had that trauma response with other people, similar trauma response. And I'm actually thinking of this morning with me. I went to this garage to pick up my car. They were fixing it. And my trigger is actually white straight men because that's who bullied me, that's who
Yeah.
assaulted me. Like that's what I experience a lot of hatred from. So I have this overcoupling to this day, like danger, danger, danger. And so you walk into like a mechanic garage, and that's essentially what you see, depending on where you
Mhm.
live. And so I walk in, there's like 6 or 7 of these men, and I notice right away my voice goes from this to I'm here to get my car, like tucked in, shoulders up, like I need to be as normal as possible so no one, hurts me. And I noticed it, which was amazing because in the my life before this was living that out. I had no idea I was even doing that, but I noticed it. And I noticed the it was that part of me that was scared.
Mhm.
And so I was like, okay, I know you're scared, but we don't know these people. Let's see what it's like to open our heart to them and then see what they do. And it was a totally different situation. It was so soft and something melted in me, and the guy made nice eye contact. It just became this like simple, unremarkable experience essentially. you know and so I think that piece there about so good for people to hear that through this language that we're using, that when we see someone doing something, and we really have to understand that word, like you said, dissociative, like not in the body, like rage, hatred, screaming, fighting, that is not an embodied state. Like
Mhm.
people think it is because we get high and we think that's embodied. They're out of their mind when that's happening. So there is no conscious decision, it's a reflex. And it's nice for us all to hear that so we can start seeing people not as bad, but as their behavior, as, oh, an extension of something unconscious,
Mhm.
and it's no one's job to even fix that for them. But when we live from that place of understanding that behavior, our obsession with hating people, it just goes like, right? It's just gone. I
Yeah.
don't even have to think about people anymore.
No, yeah,
Like,
no, I totally agree. Like, if I had to boil it down to two things, it really is that idea of staying in a place of curiosity and not taking things personal. And I guess the third thing is not about good or bad. It isn't like, how could someone do that? The question I now have is, oh, what happened to them? Because no one, to your point, wakes up in a dissociative space. Something brought them to that space. And I'm curious to know, what was that something? What's that story? Again, not to dismiss or excuse or approve the behavior, but trying to understand. Yeah, because if nothing else, like I was saying before, it's going to be applicable to other situations as well.
One thing that really changed my life was I went through this period of looking up the people who had assaulted me and trying to like find them and trying to understand, like, from a place I was at now, what would lead them to do that, and then what would lead them to make rumors about me in school, all these things. And what was profound was I started feeling this like deep sense of love for them, because I rather be me who got hurt than having hurt someone, right? And I was like, okay, I can actually feel for them because I can't imagine what it's like to live with that. And then I had discovered that one of them actually took their own life. And it was such like a confirmation of that person couldn't even stand to live in their own body, right? And I just happened to cross paths with that
Yeah.
experience. It was not because I was deformed, it wasn't because I did anything wrong. And it was this huge, and for some of you listening, it might be too far to go depending on where you are in your experience, but it really changed my life. Like when we talk about forgiveness, like something shifted in me toward that person, and then I realized they had taken their life, and then there was just all this love, like,
Yeah.
well, you can't hurt me, you're not here, you didn't even love yourself, my goodness, I'll be the one person that could love you. And that was so transformative. And
Mhm.
I just don't know where that goes for you, like what, when you think of the work you do.
Oh no, that is. I mean, it sounds hokey or cheesy, but hurt people hurt people. Like that is so true. I know we hear that a lot growing up, but it's absolutely true. And particularly as it relates to DEI, I feel like that's what I've encountered a lot when it comes to particularly like fight response, is that, well, I don't get to be my authentic self. Why should you? Why should they? I have
That's
to
right.
conform, colonize. I do all these things to change myself to fit in. You think you shouldn't have to either? And part of me wants to, no, you don't have to either. Like we can all be our authentic selves. But I think that's fundamentally the pushback we see either across different communities, and I've particularly seen this across generations. And I think that's, for example, I think that's why we hear like, oh, millennials were so entitled. Well, is it that we saw in previous generations like, oh, you had to do all these things to fit in? What if we don't? You shouldn't have had to either. We wish you had the space, the ability to be your authentic selves. We'd like to continue that evolution. I think that's one of the biggest um, foundations of any pushback to diversity and inclusion. A lot of people have. Yeah.
I just want to say to everybody, because we have to close soon, Camille is part of the membership. And so every week we work with our group, and she holds a bi-weekly sacred circle, a monthly DEI workshop there. And so any of you thinking about the membership, you can be part of it after you take the course. So if you're interested in being part of this much more private, personal space where we go deep into subjects with trauma and somatics, it's a beautiful place to be, and she's adding so much to it. And I want you to kind of tell them about how to find you outside of my work too. Like, what's your work called? How can they work with you?
Oh, yeah, yeah. So I do have a DEI practice. You can find my website, Real Talk and Brave Spaces. It's www.realtalkbravespaces.com. And through that work, I do work with groups as well as one-on-one coaching. You can also find me on LinkedIn. Yes, there are people who are still on LinkedIn under Camille Leak.
I just have to say, as like a little testimony to you, uh, I have experienced as a trauma therapist, especially in the last like 3 years. Well, I would say last 2 years, especially since George Floyd, 2020. So many people wanting to work with their unconscious bias. And the people I've seen successfully do that are people who feel safe in space with the person they're doing it with. Because if we don't feel safe with a person, we go into trauma response.
Mhm.
So if I'm sitting with someone, regardless of what the bias is, like I said, whether it's political, whether it's racial, whether it's gender, sex, money, whatever it is, whatever my bias is, if I'm sitting with someone that's like pushing me in a way that isn't trauma informed, I'm going to be fawning. I'm going to be dissociating. I'm not actually going to excavate through honesty. What you offer specifically is you give people that opportunity to literally be there without any judgment. It's that simple. And so you get to
Mhm.
reflect back to them, oh, there's your bias. Let's get curious about your bias. Like, you help them even love the bias part of them so they can transform it.
Yeah.
And I think that's really special. And anyone listening that wants to do that work should definitely reach out to you, because it's going to be quite powerful for them.
Yeah, please do. Yeah, no shame around bias. Spoiler alert, I got biases, a whole bunch of them. So
I
yeah.
feel like when you open your jacket, there's all like the watches. Like, look at all these shiny biases I have in
All
this
these
jacket.
biases.
Well, thank you, my friend. It is so sweet to have you here and share you with everybody.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.